Ixchel. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. How are you?
I'm good. It's so good to be here with you. And I know we've been itching to have this chat for a bit. And I'm so excited that we've arrived.
Yes. Well, I just want to set the stage a little. And then I just want to ask you about your insights and your perspectives and your journey to this really fascinating topic of time. So I have found myself in a bunch of kind of self-assigned workshops in my life about physical health, about money, and probably about a year ago about time. And the thought that dropped into my mind one day was, I feel like I'm at war with time. That's what I was feeling. I thought, I don't know what to do about it. I don't know exactly if I can do anything about it, but I felt like I need to look at this. And I started to kind of explore a little. And I think I might have mentioned to you, one of the first concepts that I kind of glommed onto was from The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. He called it Einstein time. And I'm sure there are a lot of different names for it, but he called it Einstein time. And the way he described it was the kind of perception-based nature of time. A moment with your beloved is like, an hour with your beloved is like a moment, and a moment on a hot stove is like an hour, something like that. And so there's a way that time stretches and morphs and contracts and expands based on what we're experiencing. And that was kind of my first little step. And then I read Stephen Hawking, which I did not understand, but I was just kind of in this desperate mode to just kind of wash myself, just kind of let it all wash over me, all these different kinds of sources that were helping me to develop a language about time. And what I started to feel was, oh, time is not just about seconds and hours, it's about agreements and relationships and expectations and relational dynamics. And that was the beginning of my experience of healing my relationship with time. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage there to say, this is where I am. So it's a year later, and I feel like I'm in a completely different relationship with time. And when I discovered that you focus on this topic, I thought, oh, I have to talk to Ixchel. So I think the first thing I want to ask you is, tell me a little bit about your journey. How did you come to even start thinking about this topic?
You know, it was really present for me all growing up. I grew up in a multicultural household and was constantly navigating the differences between those two households. My parents divorced when I was 2. And what I found was that time, my perception of time and my experience of time was very different from both the cultural norms around time and even the way that other people experience time. And I didn't really understand why, when I was growing up, why I had this real struggle to sort of navigate my way in the world. And as I got older, I realized that a piece of that was my neurodivergence, neurodiversity. I call it neuroemergence. Really grounding, you know, in sort of the Joanna Macy and Adrienne Marie bound concepts of emergent strategy and the emergence within networks and that sort of thing. And the thing that I realized is that I was struggling against these cultural norms and always losing, like to the detriment of like growing up Gen Xer, growing up latchkey kid, you know, having to get myself to school, you know, the whole institutional concepts of time about, you know, arriving on time or early, and what that means. Being able to catch the bus was like such a hard thing for me because I didn't have the same experience of time that other people did. And like this clock time was really hard. And so I walked to school a lot because we were the last bus stop. And so that was it. It was like I couldn't get to the next one, to try to catch the bus. And those experiences really shaped my sort of both frustration and also feeling like I didn't fit in the world, in terms of the modernity itself. And that left me feeling, really insufficient in a lot of ways. And as I got older and I started to really understand my context, both as multicultural, multi-ethnic, and neuroemergent, that my perception of time was my own. It was different, and that was okay. And there were certain things that I had to do to sort of navigate the world, and did my best to do that. But that as I started to understand that my experience of the world was different and that was okay, I really gained a deep sense of power in that, and just continued to explore time and my experiences of time. My family is very much created conditions for getting into flow and creativity and play in ways that, when we're in flow, we have this experience of time dilation where things speed up or slow down. And so that piece of that relationship that I had with time and being in flow was also a real difference that I saw in my family versus other people's families and experiences of time. And so as flow became more widely studied and more well-known, and I learned about this experience of time dilation, I was like, see, I'm not like, there's not something wrong with me. This is a natural state of experiencing the world and our relationship with time when we're in these beautifully creative states. And just confirmed experiences that I had growing up, that modernity had really placed on me this insufficiency, and actually, I was right where I should be. So
I love that language so much. Do you think you can find flow in conventional environments like the cubicle or the whatever these obligations are that we have, that we find ourselves in at different stages of life? I always wonder about that, because my feeling sometimes has been, I got to get out of here. If I'm in a situation that makes me feel confined, constricted, at odds with my environment, put upon, not free, my first thought is, how do I get out of here? Now I'm wondering, is there a way to morph this with my own perception of time? Is there a way to find flow even in circumstances that are not ideal? I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, it's so much research and study has been put into flow in terms of the ability for corporations to capitalize on it, because we get into these states of flow that are so incredibly deep and so immersive and so wonderful. I mean, flow creates all kinds of happy chemicals, and so it's this place where we can really do some of our most amazing things. And so, of course, capitalism wants to really get on that and utilize that for productivity and profit, right? And so a lot of the research that's been done is been to really hijack flow for the work environment and for productivity. And that's where I really bump up against the whole concept of flow for productivity. Definitely, we can utilize it to do amazing things. You know, athletes do it, and they have been able to achieve, you know, feats greater than humans have ever done in the last, you know, 100 years, especially things that, you know, people thought were impossible for our bodies to do, right? And in corporations, you know, they're trying to constantly maximize profits. It's like time over time, just keep growing those profits. We'll just squeeze out as much as we can from our people as resources. And so for me, it's like, yes, it's absolutely possible to do these amazing things in flow and, you know, get in these states of time dilation where time speeds up or time slows down. You're just so absorbed in what's happening and it feels so great. But I'm hoping that we can do that more for ourselves and for our purpose and our creativity to come forth into that purpose, and not give it all away to the powers that be. So
Yes,
yeah.
wow. I think about the fact that we're always in relationship. So I'm in this body and I'm having experiences, I'm having conversations, I'm collaborating, I'm in solitude, I'm doing all kinds of things. And I'm kind of moving through my experience. And so when I think about, like, for example, I'm self-employed, and it's very important for me to have that self-employment container because I believe in the freedom of that, like my schedule and when I work and who I work with and being able to say no and not feeling like I have to say yes or I'm going to lose my job or whatever it is. And in my brain, there's like a division between that lifestyle and the full-time employee lifestyle. One fits me and one doesn't. But that's kind of where my question was coming from. I was wondering, is there a way to still be yourself in those kinds of environments? I haven't really been able to pull it off, so I don't really know. But that's kind of where I was going with that question about finding flow. It's like finding flow for yourself, even if you're not in the ideal environment. And I don't really know what the answer is.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's some precursors to flow that we can create in our lives that really support it. And that's one of the things that I love to do, especially with folks that are self-employed or, you know, are doing really important, impactful work in the world. And so those are the folks that I really like to support in flow versus folks that are still working within modernity and whose flow is being capitalized upon, and, you know, really trying to help folks that are in those full-time, you know, sort of traditional employments to be able to find flow for themselves so that they can exit. So they have exit strategies. So a little bit of a yes and there in terms of those two different types of environments. And so, you know, flow is something that really requires a lot of attention and focus in order to get into it, which in modernity and in dominator culture, that's really hard, right? There's all kinds of things that are happening in the attention economy to pull and distract our attention from the things that matter to us in order to get our eyeballs and attention on, you know, social media, for instance, and commercials, and, you know, all those other forms of the attention economy that make a profit from us giving our attention to them. And so focus is really a thing of struggle, But when we understand that flow has a cycle and struggle is a natural part of that, and that we can be with that struggle and like honor our capacity, right? Like a lot of times we may not really be in relationship with our body in where it wants to be, right? So there's that honoring of capacity and not pushing through, which Dominator culture really, has informed us around always pushing through and, do the thing and don't be afraid and just do it. And, all of those messages that sort of come through. And so in that process of struggle, part of it is like honoring, where you're at. And then part of it is being okay with the struggle and knowing that it's a short-term process, and that when we can relax into that and expand into that struggle, that's when flow drops in.
Wow, I feel like I'm gonna cry. I can really feel that.
Yeah, and so most people don't realize that the struggle is a natural part. And people get, in that struggle phase, people will get distracted and allow those distractions to happen because of the discomfort of struggle, right? And that's where people generally tend to fall in trying to get into flow, where it's just sitting with it and just being present a little bit longer and a little bit longer and noticing how the body is and knowing that we're in that place. That's where the body can start to feel into it. And then also the sort of the biorhythmic needs of the body in terms of having certain neurochemistry that's supportive for flow. So there's a few really important chemicals that come into play. Dopamine is one. Dopamine is sort of an action neurochemical, and that's what helps us really do that struggle phase of like, okay, I'm going to be here, I'm going to sit with this. And then the other place that we need some neurochemistry is really around the oxygenation of the body and having a good amount of nitric oxide ready within our body, because that, when we get into the release phase just before flow, after struggle, we sort of relax. That's called the release phase. Having the nitric oxide is what allows all this other feel-good chemistry to start to flow and lets us relax into it. So, and then we're off to the races in terms of being in flow. But then the flip side is that it feels so good. A lot of us, we love it so much, we don't necessarily want to stop. And this is where body trust is really important, and honoring our capacity is really important, because we typically will have a good amount of the neurochemistry behind us to support about 90 minutes of flow max. And if you're like like I mentioned, extreme athletes have been really studied around this. They may have a very short flow window because they're doing something that's maybe a few minutes long, right? They're sort of working up into something that's very intensive, and it's not a long flow cycle. It's a very, immediate flow cycle. But for the majority of us, we're working on something creative. We're writing, we're painting, we're creating music, or we're working, in our business, whatever the task is. When we don't stop at that 90-minute point and we keep going because it feels so good, we're actually going beyond our capacity, and that neurochemistry runs out. And the dopamine is the really crucial one. And when we run out of dopamine, we crash. And then it takes time. It takes days, weeks, months sometimes for us to regain the amount of dopamine that we would need to come back into flow again. And also the body doesn't trust that we're going to honor our capacity to be in flow. And so there's a bit of a mismatch that happens. And so it actually makes it harder for us to come back into the cycle. And the really crucial piece of all of that flow cycle is the rest phase. And I believe that the flow cycle actually starts and ends with rest. And that if we're not honoring our need for rest in all the various ways that it's needed, because it's not just about like sleep or napping. Rest can be, being with our community, being with the people that we love. It can be, you know, being in nature. It could be a lot of different things. There's some great literature on that as well. But being able to sort of end the cycle and let the body know, okay, we did this thing and now it's time to rest. And that we rest before going into that process of going through the struggle phase. So we're really honoring our capacity. Those are the things I think a lot of folks miss when they understand that they've been in flow and they want to get back there, that there's these really supportive containers that we can create for ourselves to be able to do that.
So excited because sometimes I feel like when I go into a space, and I want you to define, if you can, or I know you can, but however you want to define flow for people who have never heard that phrase before. But sometimes when I get in there and then I get out, I feel like there's a wall and there was a door there and the door is gone and I'm touching the wall trying to figure out how to get back in. I've never really known how I got in to a flow space, to a space where everything feels like it's just, there's a momentum to whatever it is that I'm creating. And so to know that there's actually a cycle and to know that there's actually a way to think about it, that there's a 90-minute container. I didn't know that. I mean, I know what it feels like when I break that boundary. I know that, and I know that it takes a long time to recover, but I didn't understand that there was any real structure to it. So it's kind of exciting to learn that. But I wanted to ask you how would you define flow to someone who might stumble across this conversation and go, flow, what is she talking about? Or, I remember hearing that term a long time ago because my brother is a psychology professor and he introduced me to Ixchel Lunar, who I think recently passed away.
Yeah.
And so that's my reference for that word, but I don't even know if that's how you're using it. So I would love for you to say more about what flow is.
Yeah. So I define flow as the haptic relationship to the cosmos. And what I mean by that is haptic is an embodied experience. And so you might have heard of haptic if you have an Apple Watch, for instance, or a phone that vibrates. That sensation of vibration that those devices create are called haptic sensations, because they're embodied. We actually we build a relationship with those devices and they become like an extension of our bodies, which is a whole other topic. And so for me, flow is really an embodied experience of our relationship with the cosmos. And you're right, Hijacking, he defines flow as an optimal state of consciousness, a state where you feel your best and perform your best. And I read Hijacking book Flow back when it came out in the early 90s and decided to go into the study of consciousness in my graduate degree because of the experience of that book and how much it had validated what I had experienced growing up and being in a high flow family and all of that. My mentor, Stephen Kotler, he describes it, which is this beautiful poetic way, as moments of rapt attention and total absorption, where you get so focused on the task at hand that everything else disappears. Action and awareness merge. Your sense of self vanishes. Your sense of time distorts, either typically speeds up or occasionally slows down. And I just think that those are some really beautiful ways of trying to describe the undescribable, because really it's an embodied experience that you can't put words on in a lot of ways, in my opinion. But
so you did your graduate studies on this topic?
I did my graduate studies in at CIS. In the emphasis was on integral ecology, and the idea, or the term interbeing. If you're familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, he talks about the mutual causality or interdependence. And so I was really focused in those studies, studying with Joanna Macy, and actually I had been accepted into a PhD to get very deep into that particular subject. And so I had done a lot of research around around consciousness, like, sort of the neuroscience behind consciousness and the spirituality behind consciousness, and where those two things meet or don't meet. And a lot has changed in those fields since the early 2000s when I was in that program. But I ended up not continuing because my grandmother went into end stage liver failure, and I was her primary caregiver and took care of her for about 6 months until she passed, and helped midwife her through that process. I promised her that I would do my PhD. It was very important to her, because, as you know, there's not a lot of BIPOC in the higher realms of college and education and that sort of thing. And her sister's kids received a PhD and a master's, and she was really adamant that someone in her lineage would also get a doctorate. But at this point, it's been, I feel like that time has passed, and I hope that maybe some of the work that I'm doing around decolonizing time will, maybe someone will give me an honorary doctorate at some point instead. I can honor my commitment to my grandmother.
Wow, that's so beautiful. So decolonizing time, what does that mean?
Yeah. So in my cultural upbringing in particular, I like to sort of preface talking about time from my own experience. And there are many Indigenous concepts of time. And so I just want to acknowledge that, there's not necessarily one type of Indigenous time, and that I'm more specifically speaking about my upbringing and understanding of Mayan time as it relates to the Mayan calendar, and that time in that context, and the Mayan calendar in particular, are very much a description of time as an entity, as a person. So the calendar itself is this beautiful sort of description of how time is in relationship with the planet. And so there's a real highlight of time being very hyperlocal within Indigenous communities. And so when people talk about Indian time or Indigenous time, they're really talking about time in the way that they are experiencing it and relating to it where they are, which is a very different way than colonial time, which is very much clock time and calendar time in terms of the Gregorian calendar, which has been stolen, perfected, divided, and commodified, is how I would describe colonial time. And Indigenous time is relational. So it's very much a deep relationship with where people are in relationship with their locality, with the earth around them. And so the Mayan calendar is it's split into, it's at the basic level, it's two calendars that are in constant motion with each other. There's a tonal calendar, which is a cycle of 13 days that is related to the sun, and it's the relationship with the sun itself. And it goes through this solar rhythm of increasing intensity from 1 to 13. And so it's this relationship of, there's an intensity of experience that's happening over 13 days, and then it resets. And there is science that's coming about that's saying that there is a 13-day cycle to the sun, which is pretty fascinating because Mayans were astronomically very advanced for thousands of years before the West was colonized, and their calendars were incredibly precise. They had very deep relationships with the entities of the sun and the moon and Venus and, you know, the other planets as well. There were a number of different calendars that described what these relationships were that were destroyed. But the one that we all know that survived is this deep relationship between the sun and the moon. And so the other part of that calendar is a 20-day cycle that describes the characteristics of time. And that, just like we all have different types of personalities or moods, this is what this 20-day cycle is. And so the 20-day cycle of moods comes together with this intensity of the sun and how it's influencing our lives and our intensity of experience. And that sort of is a descriptor of what the day is going to be like. And so the day keepers describe this, and they have rituals around this and really honoring the mood and the tone of the day, and being in relationship with that, and not really pushing through the way that we do in modernity.
Yeah, that pushing through part, that has been probably one of the biggest parts of my self-assigned workshop. I call it soldiering. That's what I call it when I'm writing in my journal, because that's kind of like, keep going, keep going, keep going. And just kind of experimenting with ways of stepping back from that. It has been really transformational, really just to have the idea of it, not necessarily the constant achievement of that ideal, but just to have the idea of, okay, what would happen if I didn't push through right now? What would happen if I didn't soldier on right now?
Yeah.
And to see that the world didn't fall apart because I decided not to push through. And also to make room for a kind of organic creativity, or not even creativity, but a kind of organic activity in my experience.
Yeah.
There's more room for something like that when I'm not mindlessly just kind of, just kind of pushing through.
Yeah. And so the other layer of this is that hyperlocal relationship. What's happening? Where are we embedded? And as part of the earth itself and its biorhythms, if you will, like what's happening around us that is also ebbing and flowing, and being in relationship with that in terms of how much are we going to show up today and do that soldiering or pushing through, or how much do we want to honor the world around us and the environment that we're in terms of where it's at. And so it's a yes and capacity in terms of that relationship of, our collective people, animals, and the world itself, that, the earth itself. And so being in those relationships and honoring capacities both within and around us as well.
Is there a vision that inspires your work? For example, if more people felt like this or behaved like this or were aware of that, more people could experience well-being, or more people could help each other, or the world would experience something different. Is there a kind of ethos, motivating vision, spirit that you kind of just think of, like a cup in a well, something that you use to nourish and feed yourself in the work you do?
Well, I love the process of decolonizing, and the way that I really talk about that is moving from domination to relationship, right? Being in relationship with time, space, place, and the cosmos, the people around us. And that if we're in that space of being with ourselves and with others and with our place, that there's so much beauty that can come through, and peace, right? I mean, for me, that is probably the best description of peace that I could really imagine. That there's so much colonization that happens, day to day, with our bodies, with the world itself, with the earth and its resources, which is such a problem, that in order to be able to really start to create and envision a more peaceful relational world, like, it's this practice of decolonizing that we can do for ourselves and for the people around us. And what I have seen and what I've been frustrated by in the various anti-racism decolonial movements is this sort of this idea of should, and absolutely it's essential for reducing harm, right? But there's this response that people have that they should, versus this desire of being in a relationship. And it makes it hard for people to want to do it, because there's something in the way of actually doing it for the pleasure of it, because they haven't connected to the relationship aspect of it. There's still a dominator concept behind the idea of decolonizing and anti-racism that I think keeps folks from the beauty of why we do it and why it's so important. And so for me, the vision and what I have seen, flow is this place that we become autotelic, which means doing it for the pleasure of doing it. It feels so good to be in flow. And knowing how that neurochemistry works, I know that when people are doing anti-racist and decolonial work from a place of relationship and being in that beauty of what they're doing, it becomes an autotelic thing, and it becomes a very beautiful thing. So for me, that's the vision I see. And I know that there are other people that are really sort of trying to crack this net, so to speak, around why is it that people struggle to show up and be consistent in this work that's so vital for a future. And I think that for me, that's a part of it, is really the mindset of the way people are attending to the work. If they shift that and see the relationality of it, that the doors are just wide open for them to walk through and to really experience and have capacity for the pleasure of doing the work.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. Do you have a couple more minutes, or how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing good.
Okay. I think the other thing I wanted to ask about, I've had this long kind of love-hate dynamic with money and debt and labor and work and who am, all that. And I wrote a book about it. My book is about my journey to kind of try to get it together. You know, I had this self-talk, like I just can't get it together. And I was in debt and I had all these struggles. And finally, I just started I started to calm down a little. I started to turn inward. I started to get curious. And that was the beginning of starting to shift, which is why I got kind of choked up when you talked about the kind of relaxing into the struggle, because that is what's required in order to have any kind of, well, that's probably an overly superlative statement, but to have a kind of transformative experience, it helps to do that. It helps to relax into the struggle part of whatever's in front of you. And once I got out of debt, I was like, yay, I got out of debt. And then I realized I was still in debt in my mind. You know what I mean? It was like just getting rid of the dollars and cents debt was just the beginning, and I had no idea. I was still kind of like chasing money and chasing opportunities and being afraid that I was going to lose this, and what about that? And if I had enough for 30 days, what about day 31? And if I had enough for 60 days, what about day 61? And it just kept going on. And it was very, very humbling to recognize, oh, there's something I'm generating in my way of perceiving and thinking and living that's way beyond just paying Chase or Citibank, you know, making sure their debts are cleared. There's something else going on. And I think that's what led me to this whole exploration of time. I began to feel like I'm running, I'm chasing. What am I chasing? Mm-hmm. And I think that's why listening to you, it's feeding me so much just to listen to you. Mm-hmm. And I'm just so grateful that there are people in the world looking at this and exploring it and teaching about it, because to me, that's the real source of anything that could be called wealth. You know, wealth is peace. That's what wealth really is ultimately, because you'll never collect enough dollars and cents or whatever your money, whatever kind of money you have or use, you're never going to collect enough of it to make you feel like you're okay inside. You know, so I was just wondering what you think about the time money connection, anything at all that you have to say about that.
Yeah. And it's, you know, so the folks that I work with really come with time scarcity, right? Which, you know, is very akin. It's a good cousin of money scarcity. There's this, you know, deep constriction that happens around money and time. And because they have been, you know, deeply equated with each other in dominator culture, they're very much linked. And I recently came across a woman named Megan Hale, who we resonated with each other's work so much because she has been really helping people to see the relationship with money as an entity in the same way that I've been talking about time as an entity. And because I, like many folks, have had a lot of money scarcity issues and have tried my best to work on those over the years. And it's always been a bit of an enigma. And when I heard her talking about money as an entity, as a thing that you could have a relationship with and have a dialogue with and have empathy for money, that blew my mind, because that was the same sort of thing that I have seen in the way that we can decolonize so many things in our lives. Because colonization is about that separation of relationship to everything, right? It's that separation of us being embedded and embodied with the world around us. And so all the various ways that life is colonized has disrupted all of those relationships that we have. And so, yes, our relationship with money is just one of those things that's been disrupted. And so the idea of like, because people have asked me, well, I want to decolonize, but like capitalism is, right? Like we have to make money and we have to live in the world. And, and so it's hard to imagine what the world could be like if our relationships changed and were improved and deepened, and we really honored each other and the world itself, and the capacity of the world rather than extracting from the world. And our relationship with money, like what if we had a deeper relationship with money in which we could completely re-envision the world through our relationships in terms of how we exchange and move about and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's something that I'm definitely really curious about these days as a way to like really start to meet that scarcity that I have has been so constricting, and to be able to sort of like really start to deepen into that and feel into that. And I'm excited about that. So.
Yeah, it's a very rich area. Well, I could talk to you all day. I really could, but I don't want to hold you hostage. So why don't you just, why don't we wrap up and you can tell whoever comes across this video where they can find you, what you're working on, and, if they're interested in following your work, how they would do that.
Yeah, thank you. So the website decolonizetime.com is where they can go to find me. And then from there, I am on most of the socials. I mostly show up on Instagram, and I'm looking at getting more back into YouTube as well, since folks really like the visual aspect of social media. So yeah, so that would be the place where they could go and explore the workshop that I do, and as well as the wild presence coaching that I'm involved in. And yeah, so it's a great place to connect and say hi and tell me what's going on for you.
Oh, that's awesome. And of course, I'm Bridget Thompson, and anyone who comes across this video can find my work at trustyourselfwithmoney.com. And my book is called Trust Yourself with Money. So Ixchel, oh my gosh, this was so great. Thank you for sitting down with me. And I'm just wishing you all the best in the work you're doing. It's such important work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bridget.